He sat at the edge of a world that had already dismissed him. The summit hall shimmered with cold splendor, crystal chandeliers casting light too harsh to be warm, velvet curtains too thick to let in the truth. Laughter drifted like perfume, polished and empty. Power paraded itself in designer suits and calculated smiles. And yet, in that hall, there was one chair that held more gravity than gold. Ibrahim Traoré sat there, cloaked not in wealth, but in weight. To some, he was invisible. To others, a mistake in the seating plan. He wasn't supposed to shine in a room built to dim his kind. They didn't say it aloud, but their glances told stories. Too young, too African, too unschooled in their etiquette of pretending to care. They avoided his eyes, fearing they might see what they spent centuries burying: the truth, the cost, the fire they could not contain. He listened to them speak of Africa as if it were a broken vase they had tried to glue back together, not noticing the blood on their hands. They spoke of development like saviors rehearsing a sermon they had never lived: security, reform, stabilization, words so often spoken they had long since lost their meaning. But Ibrahim remembered. He remembered the nights when the electricity cut out, not for minutes but for weeks. He remembered when aid trucks passed hungry villages because the maps didn't list the roads that led to the poor. He remembered what it felt like to be a soldier with a weapon older than the war he was fighting. He remembered the silence of funerals no camera ever covered. Now, they wanted to talk policy. The leaders around the table flaunted decades of experience, but not the kind that comes from digging graves in red soil or explaining death to a child too young to understand. War. They spoke with confidence, but none of it was rooted in the earth. Traoré's hands rested on the table, but his heart was back in the villages where barefoot girls walked 5 miles for water and boys memorized lessons by candlelight. He didn't need notes. His country was written into his soul. The summit continued without him. Or so they thought. They mispronounced the name of his nation, laughed through talks of regional dysfunction. Someone made a joke about coups. He didn't flinch. He had seen too much to be shaken by words. What they didn't know was that Traoré wasn't there for applause. He wasn't there to smile for the cameras. He wasn't there to beg. He was there because his people had endured enough lectures, enough manipulation, enough being used as background in a global drama that never had a script for their survival. A low voice beside him whispered into a translator's headset. Another leader glanced past him as if he were merely the staff. One even nodded politely and turned away before hearing a single word. He had never felt so present in a place that wanted him absent, but that's what made him dangerous, because a man who has lived through the fire does not need their approval. A man who carries the pain of 1,000 forgotten names has no desire to please. They saw a soldier. They missed the storm. At the corner of that room, the future was waiting for its cue. Traoré knew his moment would come, not to interrupt, but to erupt. There is a silence that lives just before the truth. It hums like thunder deep beneath the floorboards. And in that silence, Ibrahim sat still, not defeated, not ignored. But ready. He did not shout. He did not brandish pamphlets or wave flags. He spoke as if every word were forged in fire, each syllable a hammer blow to complacency and compromise. Ibrahim Traoré rose and leaned into the hush that fell over the chamber. All around him, polished suits froze in mid-gesture, not because they feared violence, but because this was violence of another kind, the violence of truth. He had chosen his words with care, like a surgeon selecting the blade that would heal. You speak of our nations as if they were projects you can design and abandon. He began, voice even yet charged with something that trembled beneath. You speak of stability as if it were your gift to bestow, forgetting that it is our blood, our tears, our sacrifice that have bought it. He looked at the rows of faces bright with confidence yet dimmed by distraction. They counted budgets in their heads and calculated risks as if lives were spreadsheets. He refused to let them reduce human suffering to numbers. My people, He continued, have for too long been the backdrop to your debates. We have been footnotes in your histories, temporary headlines in your news cycles. You send aid that arrives late and incomplete, then ask why we remain poor. You promise reform, yet deepen the wells of our despair. His hands rested on the table, knuckles white. Behind him, the flags of the world formed an audience of empty promises. He pressed forward. Ask yourselves this, he said. What good is a promise when the roads you build lead only to mines? What good is partnership when your companies leave rivers poisoned and leave our children to die of cholera? No one interrupted. Because when a man speaks with the weight of a continent carried in his chest, there is no room for applause. There is only the echo of conscience. He allowed a moment for that echo to settle before delivering the line that would awaken thousands. Comment below if you refuse to be silenced. Right, I remember who I am if you will stand with us in. This moment of reckoning, his call was not a plea. It was a challenge. A summons to every person who had felt invisible, dismissed, erased. A reminder that identity cannot be stolen and that voice, once reclaimed, resonates across oceans. He paced the edge of the dais with deliberate steps. Each footfall seemed to shake the foundations of their certainty. You claim to champion democracy, yet you bankroll dictators who betray their own people. You declare solidarity, yet you profit from conflict. You parade your virtue, yet you consign innocence to suffering so that your markets may expand. In that room, the air crackled with truth. Not violent truth, but the kind that pierces armor and lays bare the heart. He paused again. The silence now was not uncomfortable, it was necessary. It was a womb of possibility, waiting to birth change. When we stand to speak, legacy demands we speak whole. Speak our pain, our dignity, our demands for justice. He reached inside his coat and drew out a photograph, edges worn, colors fading. He placed it gently on the table. A child's face looked up, eyes wide with wonder and fear. This is Salamata, he said. She walked 2 days for water that tasted of death. She dreamed of school, but learned instead the weight of neglect. He let her eyes hold the room in their sorrow. No one could look away. Let her story be more than a footnote, he said softly. Let it be the opening chapter of responsibility. Then he stood still, as if trusting the truth to finish his thought. Someone shifted in their seat. A cough echoed. A pen fell. Traore leaned forward and spoke the final line he had carried in his heart. Since childhood, we are not asking your permission to live with dignity. We are taking it back. Remember that. He sat down. There was no applause, no fanfare, but the tremor in the room was unmistakable. Laptops closed, voices hushed. Heads bowed not in submission but in contemplation. The president they had ignored had spoken. He had planted a seed of reckoning. And in the silence that followed, they could feel it growing. They thought it would end there. A speech, a ripple, a moment of disruption that would soon dissolve into the usual ceremony of handshakes and empty declarations. But what Traore had done was not simply deliver words. He had cracked something open. And now the world inside that chamber was beginning to shift. He had not left the room. He had become the room. For the first time in hours, the summit veered off script. Delegates who once spoke in confident generalities now hesitated before reaching for their microphones. Those who had dismissed him as a symbol now felt the weight of substance in their lungs. What they had encountered in Traore was not resistance, but resurrection. Some tried to recover their footing, to reassert control through bureaucracy. One veteran statesman leaned forward and praised the passion of youth, attempting to soothe the sting of truth with patronizing balm. Another suggested dialogue on equal terms, as if history had not already screamed that equality was never their starting point. Traore listened, but his silence was no longer passive. It had become a force that made others nervous. A quiet so heavy it turned the air thick. He looked at them without flinching. His eyes filled not with anger, but with the certainty of a man who knew his soil, his people, and the roots they had grown from pain. They began to stumble on their words. not because they feared reprisal, but because they had been reminded of something they had long tried to forget. The fire beneath their feet was not ash. It was still burning. Behind the scenes, whispers surged like tides. Security advisors messaged each other. Journalists refreshed their feeds. Traoré's words had already begun to circulate outside the hall, fragmenting across social media, translated not into perfect syntax, but into something stronger: human recognition. In Ouagadougou, a mother played back the video in a crowded cafe where the power had flickered just an hour before. A child leaned in, eyes wide. A taxi driver pulled over to the side of the road and turned up the volume. Soldiers on border posts passed the clip from phone to phone, their fatigue momentarily forgotten. This was not merely a political moment. It was a spiritual one, and the fire spread. Inside the summit, a younger delegate from a forgotten nation rose to speak. Not from a seat of comfort, but from a wound of familiarity. "Ibrahim," she said, "you have spoken for more than just your country today. You have spoken for us all." Traoré nodded but said nothing. The others could no longer ignore him. Cameras that once avoided him now swung into place. Analysts scribbled his name with newfound interest. But he didn't flinch at the attention. He wasn't there to trend. He was there to testify. A few of the older leaders still tried to contain the moment. One diplomat whispered that Traoré's approach was not helpful to diplomacy. Another called it emotional. But emotion is the language of those who have bled. It is the dialect of the dispossessed. And what the world had just heard was not emotion, it was exodus. A departure from centuries of silence. Then came the second moment. Quiet but roaring in spirit. As the session neared its break, a voice from the back stood up, a leader once known for towing the line. He looked not at the others but directly at Traoré. "Ibrahim," he said, "you reminded us of what we lost when we chose comfort over courage." Then, without cue, he spoke the phrase that had already begun to echo across thousands of comment sections online. "I remember who I am." A wave of chills moved through the hall. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And truth, once spoken, is contagious. That phrase became more than a comment. It became a mirror, a reckoning, a silent pledge. Others began to write it down. Some said it under their breath. Some simply sat with their shame. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't need to. He looked down at the photograph of Salamata still resting on the table. She didn't know what she had started. But perhaps she didn't need to. Sometimes the ones who change the world are too busy surviving to know it. And sometimes a president becomes a prophet, not by predicting the future, but by daring to remember the past. The summit continued. Or at least it pretended to. Presentations resumed. Statistics danced on glowing screens, and policy outlines returned to the table like rehearsed theater. But something had broken. The air no longer obeyed the order of protocol. Beneath the silence and routine, there was a murmur, subtle but alive. It moved like water under ice, like memory returning to a body long numbed. And Traoré? He simply watched. He watched how the hands of powerful men trembled slightly when they reached for their pens. He watched the lips that once smiled too easily curl into uncertain lines. He watched the scripts unravel, because when truth is finally spoken in a room built on denial, every echo turns into a reckoning. Some began to whisper that Traoré had embarrassed the summit, that his words had hijacked the agenda. But no one said it out loud. Because in truth, he had done something far more dangerous. He had told the world that dignity does not need permission. One delegate approached him during the recess. Quietly, carefully. "You speak with the conviction of someone who has nothing to lose," the man said. Traoré looked at him, eyes steady. "No," he replied. "I speak with the knowledge of what has already been lost." That answer silenced the conversation, because there is nothing more dangerous to systems of control than a man who speaks not from ambition, but from burial grounds. A man who has counted the dead and chosen to carry their names forward. Outside the summit hall, the world was already changing. In West Africa, murals of Traoré's face appeared overnight on walls once blank with despair. In Europe, students quoted his speech in lectures once blind to colonization's aftermath. In Latin America and Asia, community leaders drew parallels. Between their own forgotten voices and the thunder of his words, people weren't just sharing what he said. They were remembering what they had forgotten about themselves. I remember who I am. It began to appear like a rising tide in comment sections, across languages and borders. A whisper in Swahili, a declaration in Arabic, a quiet chant in Spanish, a shout in Creole. The phrase became a lifeline. Farmers scrawled it on their carts. Teachers wrote it on chalkboards. Refugees murmured it into the night as they crossed invisible lines. It was a statement of rebellion, but also of return to the truth, to the earth. To self. At the summit, the energy had shifted so completely that even the organizers could not deny it. In an unscheduled amendment, a time slot was offered to Traoré for a closing reflection, a formality perhaps, a gesture to calm the storm. But the storm was not his to calm anymore. It had outgrown him. He stood again. No notes. No projection. I do not come here to make enemies, he said gently. I come to remind you that the peace you speak of cannot be planted in soil still. Weeping from theft, his voice carried no bitterness. Only memory. A memory so heavy it made the room lean inward. We cannot speak of partnership when our pain is priced into your profits. We cannot speak of stability when our youth are dying, not because they are violent, but because they are voiceless. He paused. In your world we are numbers, in ours we are names. He placed his hand over his heart. My country is not a case study, it is a cry. One that has echoed long before I was born and will continue long after I am gone. No applause followed. It didn't need to, because those who had ears had already heard what mattered. As Traoré took his seat for the final time, he turned not to the leaders beside him, but to the photograph still resting on the table. I may, to the little girl who had unknowingly become the symbol of a nation's demand to be seen. In that moment, the summit wasn't about treaties or transactions. It was about truth. And the truth had spoken, not with violence, but with reverence. It had moved like wind through cracked windows, through tired lungs, through the tight fists of forgotten people. The world now had a choice: to forget, as it always had, or to remember finally who it was. I remember who I am, let them comment it again. Let it swell until it drowns the noise. Let it live where no summit can silence it. Because truth, once remembered, becomes a fire no force can extinguish. The summit ended as all summits do, with photos, with final statements, with signatures inked onto papers that would sit in drawers dusted with diplomacy. Delegates departed in cars with tinted windows, escorted by protocol and guarded by habit. The cameras shut off. The microphones were packed away, but something refused to leave the room. Traoré walked out not like a man who had won, but like one who had simply told the truth and laid it down like a blade on a table. He carried no briefcase, no speech notes, no prepared press release. Only the echo of his own heartbeat and the silence that followed him wherever he went now. Outside, the sky was pale, the wind gentle. Reporters waited at a distance, unsure whether to approach. The world had seen something unfamiliar, a leader who had not asked for power, but carried purpose instead. As he stepped into the car waiting for him, his aide leaned over and whispered, "You've started something." Traoré didn't answer. He only looked forward, eyes steady, heart burning with names the world would never know. In the days that followed, the summit was picked apart by analysts and headlines, but none of their summaries captured what had really changed. Because what changed wasn't in the documents or declarations. It was in the hearts of those who had watched, those who had heard, and those who had seen, perhaps for the first time, that truth does not need permission to speak. In the markets of Bamako, a fruit seller painted his stall with the phrase, "I remember who I am." In a slum in Nairobi, a young woman began teaching girls beneath a torn tarp. writing those words in charcoal above their heads. In a quiet village near Bobo Dioulasso, Salamata's mother lit a candle and placed her daughter's photo next to it. She had no way of knowing the world had seen her child's face. But she felt it. Somehow, she felt it. That's the thing about truth. It travels without passports. It speaks every language. It enters rooms no invitation can reach. Traore returned to Burkina Faso not as a man exalted, but as a man understood. The people lined the streets, not to celebrate him, but to honor what he carried. They didn't chant his name. They chanted something greater. We remember who we are. It rippled through the crowds like rainfall on dry earth. 1,000 voices rising, not in rage, but in rebirth. He stood at the balcony of the presidential palace, looking over the city that had shaped his spine, his soul, and his silence. He thought of the boy he once was, the one who stared at broken textbooks by candlelight and wondered if anyone would ever listen to the truth inside him. He smiled softly. Not the smile of a man victorious, but of one who had kept a promise. And when the lights of the city dimmed, when the world resumed its forgetting, one thing remained: quiet, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that follows transformation. In that quiet, people began to ask different questions about their governments, about their histories, about their dignity. In that quiet, revolutions were born not of violence, but of memory. And in that quiet, the story of a man who was once ignored became the story of a world beginning to see itself again. So let them forget the summit's closing speech. Let them discard the brochures and the photo ops, but let them never forget the moment a man stood alone, uninvited and unafraid, and told the world a truth it had spent centuries trying not to hear. Let them never forget the silence that followed. Because sometimes it is not the applause that changes history. It is the quiet that comes after the truth.